Welcome back to Historical Projects, a community podcast exploring project success and leadership. I'm David. Today we're heading to Toronto, Canada, to look at a project that redefined a skyline and solved a national communications challenge and stood as the world's tallest freestanding structure for more than 3 decades. Yes, as you guessed it, it's the CN Tower. To help us unpack this remarkable story, I'm joined by Jean-Philippe Hudon. Now, he's a manager in the processing industry. JP began his career as a reliability engineer in the sulfuric acid plant. Jean-Philippe brings a passion for history and a wonderful ability to connect the past to the challenges we face in modern leadership. I'm thrilled to have him here. Jean-Philippe, or as we know you, JP, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dave, for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's get started. JP, do you remember the first time you saw the CN Tower or another structure that made you stop and look up?
I first saw the CN Tower when I was a kid, and I grew up in a small French-Canadian town. And although very small city, I was fortunate enough that they offered English school for kids in sixth grade. So in sixth grade, I attended English school so that I could learn it as a second language. And our year-end trip was a visit to Toronto, which was the furthest I had been in Canada, kind of thing, outside of my small town. And I had never seen anything like it back then. It's a truly massive structure. I remember going up in the tower, which takes forever when you're a kid, right? The elevator takes a few minutes to get you to the top, and then when you get in the room, there's a glass floor that you can step onto. And it's funny because a lot of people won't do it, you know. And when you're a kid, the fact that people won't go on it makes you think it might be unsafe kind of thing. Of course, it's perfectly safe and fine. So I remember going on it and jumping on the floor, right? And other visitors were looking at us kids, you know. It's not just me, obviously, but people who are scared don't find those kind of things funny.
Now, JP, let's start right at the beginning. Now, can you take us back to Toronto in the 1970s to set the scene to this incredible structure?
Yeah, of course. So if we go back to the late 60s and the early 70s, Toronto was booming and a lot of skyscrapers were rising. Business was expanding, the city was transforming into a global hub. But with that growth came a problem. Radio and television signals were bouncing off the new high rises that were built in the city. And this created a major communication challenge and communication gaps where you had dead areas. And the Canadian National Railway, and yes, that is the same company that ran trains across the country, decided to take on the challenge. They envisioned a tower so tall and so structurally sound, so technologically advanced that it would broadcast signals clearly across the entire region. And in doing so, they would also showcase the strength of Canadian engineering and industry. And that's where the tower is getting its name from, right? The CN Tower is the Canadian National Railway, and that's where the name is from.
No way. I thought
Yeah.
it was the CN as in the news and things like that. I thought it
No.
was a promotional marketing thing. I had no idea. JP, what's your personal connection to Toronto or to landmarks that define a city's identity?
Yeah, so I actually lived in Toronto for 2 years, and I love this city. It's very well engineered. It's a clean city. It's full of different things to experience. It's quite multicultural, so there's a bit of everything. It's perfect engineer city, to be honest. Like people will say that it lacks a bit of soul if you compare it to Quebec or Montreal, but for me, like the square layouts of the street, the functional speedways, the subway system, it's all well engineered and thought through, and you could see like very, very good design went into it. So I absolutely love it.
Well, while we're talking about the project itself, can you take us through the construction of such an incredible tower? What was it all about and how was it done?
Okay, so the construction began on February 6, 1973, with more than 1,500 workers contributing to the effort. The project team worked for 24 hours a day, 5 days a week, pouring concrete into a massive slip form that climbed continuously upward. And the key word here is continuously. This was an engineering ballad of precision and endurance because if you pay attention to details, one of the things you'll notice is the CN Tower has no joint. It's a single piece of concrete. It's a continuous concrete pour that they did at the time. Now, can you imagine the logistics involved in 1973 to get that done? That was quite an engineering achievement. So by February 1974, it was already the tallest structure in Canada, although it was not finished. In 1975, a giant Sikorsky, that's a tough name to pronounce, that's an helicopter that they named Olga, and it lifted the 39 antenna pieces into place. And that was one of the most dramatic construction moments in Canada history. So the tower officially opened to the public on June 26, 1976, standing at 553 meters tall, making it the tallest freestanding structure in the world for 32 years.
It was way ahead of the game. 32 years, when you think of that in terms of modern construction, that was a
That
real leap. That was a
yeah,
big
that
leap.
brings us to the early 2000s kind of thing, right?
JP, when you think about the ambition behind building something like this, the CN Tower, Canadian National Tower, what memories or experiences from your own career come to mind?
Well, for me, this is a great showcase of vision. If we look at it pragmatically, the CN Tower is an antenna, right? And so they could have laid those telecom devices on another skyscraper. You pick the tallest you got that day, and you call it a day, right? But instead, they decided to build a landmark, and it has shaped our country. Things can be and can mean so much more than their main function. And you can imagine the team involved back then, going to the CN Railway Board, trying to convince them that they're going to spend all that money to build a tower that has nothing to do with railway, that will bring no EBITDA or income to the company. And they are going to dedicate this vast amount of money and resources to build it and to call it the CN Tower. So that it takes vision to do that. Like I can only imagine how hard of a sell that was. But they did it, and they reshaped Canada.
We're now 2026. What is the role of the tower today?
Yeah, so the CN Tower still serves a major telecom hub function, supporting more than 17 Canadian TV and radio station. It's also one of Canada's most visited attraction, drawing over 2 million visitors annually. Up the CN Tower, there's an observation deck. There's two actually. So there's the one that has the glass floor, and there's the other one that has the sky pod on 447-meter, and it offers some of the most breathtaking views in the Western Hemisphere. There's a revolving restaurant that's perched more than 350 meters above the city, and this, going to the CN Tower remains a bucket list item dining experience. So today, the CN Tower is still the tallest freestanding structure on land in the Western Hemisphere, and it's a defining symbol of Toronto's identity.
And even for Canada, I imagine, is look, when they
Yes.
built it, it was a major bit of construction.
One thing that's not well known is there's a museum in the CN Tower. Obviously, it's not at the top; it's in the basement. But not a lot of people take the time to visit it. But it's actually free if you go to visit the CN Tower. If you go to the top, you can go to the museum, and they have obviously like archives from the construction days, and you can see the various stages of construction. It's very impressive. It's well worth your time if you go there.
So, JP, another question. Have you ever visited or worked on a project where the sheer scale changed your sense of what is actually possible? I imagine like those 1,500 workers who were doing the concrete pour, they probably thought,
Yeah.
I've done the garage, I've done our local driveway, but what about this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The largest construction I've seen in my career was when I did a bit of consulting work earlier in my career, and I had the chance to visit OCP in Morocco. So OCP stands for the Office Chérifien des Phosphates. So Morocco is the largest producer of phosphate in the world, and the phosphate is inland, right? So it's in, you could say like Center Morocco, if you will. But the challenge is if you want to produce phosphate-based fertilizer, you need phosphoric acid, and to turn the phosphor into phosphoric acid, you'll need sulfuric acid. And Morocco doesn't have a lot of sulfur, so they import most of it, if not all of it, by ship. So it doesn't make sense to bring the sulfur from the sea and bring it inland because then they will need to export the product back anyway. So what they do is they have a massive, massive slurry pipe where they transport the phosphor from the land to the shore. So that's over 200 kilometers of pipe. And that's an enormous pipe. Like, if I remember correctly, it's like 2 meters in diameter of pulp. So you can imagine the pumping station and everything. And then when they bring it to the shore, they have like a massive acid plant complex. So where my career began, kind of thing, we had a 2,000 ton per day production plant, and it's a sizable plant. Kind of, if you look it on Google, like it's a big footprint. Well, they built, and that's dating back to 2017, so there might be more of them now, but they had built 30 plants like these, and some of them were twice as big. So they had the largest commercially viable plant, which were 5,000 per day. And beyond that size, you really need parallel operating units because everything becomes too big, right? So the equipment are no longer, they're too large to be fabricated and shipped, kind of thing. And then you would have to build everything on site, and the cost rises very, very fast. So 5,000, I think the largest is 5,600. But yeah, they had built 30 of these. So it's a city of sulfuric acid plant, really. So for a young engineer, that was quite interesting, and it's still marvelous, I find.
Are there any facts that interesting that you've researched around the tower?
Yeah, of course. So if we go back to that glass floor that you can stand on, this piece of glass can support the weight of 14 large hippos. So obviously, a young kid jumping on it would make absolutely no difference. It's hard to see when you're standing on it, but it's actually super thick. And the tower can withstand winds of above 400 kilometers per hour and earthquakes up to 8.5 on the Richter scale. Its elevators travel at 22 kilometers per hour, so you can reach the main deck under a minute. It contains 1,776 step, which is a favorite challenge for charity climbers. And it once held the record of the highest wine cellar in the world, which was 351 meters above ground. So it's quite an impressive structure.
Thanks, JP. That's a really good start to this journey we're going on. So now that we've explored the story of the CN Tower in Toronto, I'd love you to open this up and connect it to the world of modern projects and leadership. There are so many lessons hidden in this building. JP, when I reflect on what you've already told us about this incredible structure and doing so many things for the first time, it's a really complex project. If you think about your career, what's the most complex or high-risk project you've worked on, and what did it teach you about leading under pressure?
For me, the most complex project have always been shutdowns and turnarounds, because obviously you take the whole plant down, and for that period of time you're not generating any revenue and you're spending a lot of money, right? So it's a double it's a double effect, if you will. And you often bring in a lot of new people, a lot of people who've never been to the plant. That's often when you execute projects where you replace equipment, where you refurbish important portion of the process. So there's always an element of new right? Coming into shutdowns and turnaround. It's a big coordination effort. You bring in a lot of parties. They all have their different agendas. Sometimes it might be built in their contract that it's advantageous for them to, finish before the schedule, but then what about quality? So you need to be, there's a lot of stakeholders to bring in together. It's a huge coordination effort.
And when I think of my career, I found the technical work I was comfortable with, but the stakeholder management I struggled with.
Mm,
Because being an introvert, it's hard to communicate, and stakeholder engagement's all about communication.
yeah.
So often I would hesitate to try and do that communication, but I realized as I became more and more experienced that the technical stuff often is not the problem. Projects don't fail technically. I imagine this concrete pour wouldn't have failed technically. It could have been because someone forgot to tell someone to tell someone to tell someone to do something. And then we look at it technically. And I think of that, the CN Tower, the stakeholders would have been enormous. They would have had the media every day, and the whole of the city would have been watching the progress of this building. And they would want updates. They would
Yes.
want news. And I would imagine there would have been this whole buzz trying to build this iconic structure to a launch date, which it was. It's incredible.
And
It
you're building
really
in
is.
plain sight, right? So if
Yeah.
if you say you're 50% done, but the tower is only 25% high, you're hiding something, but everybody
And
can
of
see it,
course,
kind of thing. So
you're right. And I can imagine the media's looking for something.
yeah.
And I could see, so I can see those stakeholders. I can see the stakeholders internally, Canadian National Railway. They would have had all of these stakeholders internally, high profile, nowhere to hide. You would have had the government. You would have had the communities, the public. And then, of course, you would have had the project teams,
Hmm.
and all of these people would have been having to manage to keep them aligned and on track to deliver the scope of work safely. Really, really, really a complex project. And I think it's all valid even to the day-to-day work in the small projects that I've run. As I said, it doesn't have to be a CN Tower. It could just be a small project, but the complexity is the same in engaging with people. How do you personally balance ambition with risk when leading a project?
Risk for me is very interesting because like the longer you stay in the industry, the more you realize that everything is risk based. Like it's very, very rarely black or white. So we need to learn to tolerate risk, right? Zero risk is way too costly and often impractical, and it would make any project completely unviable. On the other hand, I also think as managers, we must assume things will go wrong and we must prepare our response before the risk materialize. So if we think back to that continuous concrete pour, for sure, they did not work with a single cement plant or a fleet of ready-mix truck with no spare kind of thing. Like they must have planned for outages at the plant and failure of the trucks. Otherwise, you can imagine you would put the whole project at risk, right? So risk is inevitable. Things will go wrong, but our strength as project managers and as technical leaders is to prepare for what could go wrong and then put a countermeasure in place so that when things do go wrong, you're ready for it.
JP, I've often reflected on this. Do you think risks are a friend or a foe?
I think they're a friend, right? Because if there
That's what I
was
think.
if there
That's
was
what I
no
think.
if there was no risk, there would be no opportunity. Because if there's no risk, then everybody's willing to take on the challenge, right? So it would mean like there would be no differentiating factor, between, like two project managers or two firms or two, like anybody could do it, right? So if it's almost like saying if things were easy, people would have already done it, or if things were easy, anybody could do it, right? And the reason why things are hard is not only, because of the technical challenge at hand, but also because of risk and how we prepare to it, and the uncertainty, right? If you could have certainty in a big project like this, a lot of people would be willing to do it. But because you don't, it's almost always a leap of faith. But for the people who are willing to take that leap of faith, well, um, great things can come, right?
Because I know when I used to work in risk and run risk workshops, I always would say to people that the risk is a gem because it could go wrong, but if you identify it and work with it, it will never go wrong. And I tried to get people, because often with risk, we sort of put our fingers in our ears and go,
Yeah.
la, 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 we don't want to know about it because we can be quite scared by it. But I find risk really is a friend that we have to engage. And if we engage it, we'll be okay. But if we ignore it, the risk is that things could go wrong. And also, I liked what you said earlier. A risk can also be an opportunity that we could
Yeah.
miss. This is quite a reflective question because we know the CN Tower has left a legacy to a lot of people, a lot like those 1,500 people, the pride they would have had in building this iconic building. When you think about your work, what legacy do you hope your own work will leave behind?
Well, obviously, I'm not building anything as large or as fun as a CN Tower kind of thing, but I do hope that I will have had a positive impact and influence on the people I work with. When you're responsible for other people's performance, you also become partly responsible for their career. This is a privilege that we must handle with care. So my greatest hope is that, years from now, I'll have people, hopefully, meet and come back to me and say, like that time in my career you had a positive impact, and this decision led to that. And you never really know in the moment where things are going to go, but hopefully that's the biggest legacy I think I can leave.
It's interesting you say that because I've also been thinking about legacy because of my books. But the more I think about it, the legacy is actually in the people that we work with. I don't think people in 100 years are going to pick up one of my books. But I hope that the people I've worked with, that I've enjoyed working with and done some really cool things, will reflect and have memories of the stuff we did. And then I hope that they will then share that with the people they work with. And then they will share that. So I sort of believe a lot of our legacy comes through the communication of the people that we work with rather than all the material things, because we all don't build CN towers for
No.
sure. JP, this has been a really interesting discussion around risk, but there's lots of parts to risk. And one is psychological safety as we engage in the risk. So, how do you create psychological safety in teams when they're tackling difficult or high stakes work? What do you do? What have you learned to do?
Well, I think the first rule is don't shoot the messenger, right? So when people bring you bad news, you must be very careful in how you respond and how you react, right? If you get mad, if you yell at people, if you lose your temper, very soon you'll hear no bad news at all, right? People will no longer bring in the bad news or the tough feedback, and it's easy for us and for you to think all is well, and but the truth is you're fooling yourself, right? It takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to admit you've made a mistake. So when anyone does that, it should always be met with empathy.
JP, in your career, have you been the messenger and been shot? And what was that like? How did you feel when that happened?
Well, not necessarily being shot, but of course, like when something comes up, right? And like obviously, like as leader in any organization, you're not paid to report problem. You're paid to solve them, right? So the first thing you want to do, is if you have bad news, is at least start the thinking process on what you're going to do about it, right? So I think that's a responsibility we have. But sometimes things go so fast, and something happen that is is really bad or could have like large impact to the organization. So much so that you need to report it right away. And the truth it often is, at that moment in time, you don't know yet what you're going to do about it. And oftentimes as leader, when we hear those news, well, we have 10 or 20 questions that we want to ask about it. Happened to me a few times where you don't have answers to those questions just yet. But so it's a bit of a balance, right? So you need to to adapt to the situation. So I think the best approach is to come in prepared and have a few options to put on the table with the bad news so that there's actually something you can do about it. But if you don't, then I think it's important to have that level of confidence with your leader kind of thing that, hey, okay, this is the situation. I'm on it. I don't know quite yet how I'm going to solve this thing, but trust me, I will, and revert back kind of thing.
What's interesting about that, JP, is that often when we're communicating bad news, it may not actually be a technical thing, but it relies so heavily on our communication and influencing skills to manage what's all going on, which is a real lesson for me because often we get buried in the technical and we think the technical thing's the issue, but often it's around the people and the way we communicate. And how do we manage that difficult thing?
Absolutely.
Let's look at this from another angle. If you imagine the 1,500 workers who built the tower, what human stories do you fold in behind the scenes? And how does that resonate with your own project experiences? 1,500 people in a very tight area
Yeah.
doing something incredibly unique, not being done. The risks and the safety and all of that stuff are pretty high.
So one thing I can share with you is that the safety standards in the 70s were nowhere near where they are today. That's for sure. So if we go back to that small museum I mentioned earlier, like if you go in there, you'll see clips from the construction, and it's impressive throughout kind of thing. But when they start building that structure where that you can now walk on today, you can imagine like when it begins, it's only a few pieces of steel sticking out of concrete. There's nothing to stand on, and there's nothing to hook yourself like above, right? And you can see the steel workers eating their lunch sitting on a tiny piece of column 400 meters above the ground. It's marvelous to see, and you can only imagine the courage that these men had back then. And I don't think that's how we build structure nowadays.
As we close out, JP, what would you like to share with people? What's the biggest insight or lesson or reflection that you've got from this incredible building?
Well, for me is the importance of different perspective, right? So as a leader, it's I think it's more important to learn what your dead angles are, and your areas of weakness, and try to surround yourself with people who don't share the same weaknesses as you do, so that they can expand the way you perceive things and the way you see the project and the way you can move things forward, right? So I think the strength resides in team of diversity where collaboration is key.
Well, what a great way to finish. So thanks so much, Jean-Philippe, or JP, as I know you. As I reflect on your story, I see the CN Tower isn't just a tall building, it's a story of ambition, innovation, and national pride for Canada. It must have been a cool thing to be part of and to watch. And to be able to say, I was part of that team. There's not many of us that can say that, that represents a whole country's pride. It's incredible. And to our listeners, thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most extraordinary projects. Until next time, keep looking to the past for leadership lessons that shape our future.